Every 23 seconds, someone is arrested for drug use in the United States. In the last 40 years, incarceration rates have increased by over 500%. But is there really a correlation between drug use and crime? And why do people have the need to feel they know what's best for others? The drug problem in America is a product of collective narcissism. Large groups of people, highlighted by those in positions of political control, carry a greater sense of value due to their abstinence of drug use. For decades, political and cultural influencers have negatively stigmatized the use of drugs and effectively dehumanized the users themselves. This hasn't always been the case. In fact, drugs were once considered to be just another substance, similar to alcohol and tobacco. Marijuana, opium, and cocaine were even common components of many medicinal treatments, and some were used in over-the-counter products like Coca-Cola and wine. It was even used recreationally by many people, all walks of life. It wasn't until the temperance movement at the turn of the 20th century that moderation and abstinence of alcohol, tobacco, and drug use gained traction and took hold as American political issues. And in 1914, the Harrison Act was signed into effect by President Woodrow Wilson. This was the first national strike against drug use, and it heavily regulated and taxed the production, importation, and distribution of opiates and cocaine. Later in Wilson's tenure, he signed into effect the 18th Amendment, which forbid the sale, manufacture, and transport of alcohol, which, as we know, was a resounding failure, and repealed 14 years later with the 21st Amendment.
We interrupt this program to bring you a special report.
It was during Woodrow Wilson's presidency that the United States took a sharp pivot away from ingrained libertarian values. And though he supported the women's right to vote, he also supported Jim Crow and segregation laws, as he was a known racist. His administration undercut many rights to individual liberty with actions like the Espionage and Sedition Acts, Wartime Prohibition Act, and the Selective Service Act. He also injected the intrusion of government into private businesses and opened the door to national debt with the implementation of the Federal Reserve and Federal Commission Act. It was his tenure that paved the way to the immense oversight of government on private citizens and businesses we see today.
And now back to your regularly scheduled program.
After the failed attempt of prohibition, righteous politicians turned their efforts towards Sweet Mary Jane and instituted the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937. As it states, it taxed the sale of cannabis, hemp, and marijuana, but it did not criminalize it. Drug use was a non-issue during and directly after the Second World War. States and counties would regulate as they saw fit, but on a national scale, it gained no significant attention. And use of drugs was still ongoing, but because of the lack of interest by politicians and news outlets, it did not impact the overall perception of it. But thanks to the hippies in the era of love and media becoming more visual with televisions, coupled with them being a more common household item, the 1960s saw a boost in recreational drug use. I don't know, maybe the continuous threat of nuclear war during the Red Scare, or the threat of being sent to war against your will, had something to do with it. Enter Richard Milhous Nixon and his 1970 nightmare year. This year specifically weighed heavy on Tricky Dick, and is considered to be the year that turned up his paranoia from a 10 to 11. After calling for the ground invasion of Cambodia, students at Kent State University gathered in protest of the Vietnam War. It was then that the National Guard fired into the students, killing 4 and wounding 9. The anti-war sentiment grew exponentially following the Kent State massacre, and thus sent Nixon's support among the youth spiraling. It also sent Nixon into depressive bouts and worry. Nixon's racism didn't help him with the minority groups either. His support was waning with both of those groups, and naysayers of the war effort were creeping up even more throughout the political landscape, and even close to his administration. It was in 1971 that Nixon officially ushered in his war on drugs. He was a year away from a re-election campaign and still deeply entrenched in the Vietnam War when he unveiled his new agenda. Some would say it was a political prerogative aimed at those groups he was struggling with. John Ehrlichman, Nixon's domestic affairs assistant, was quoted as saying, "We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news." Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. You mad yet? I am. But Nixon did pursue the war on drugs as a public health issue and did promote treatment and prevention programs. But whether it was political maneuvering or his documented disdain for drugs, probably a bit of truth in both of those, the damage had already been done. Carter slowed the momentum on the drug war temporarily as he moved to decriminalize marijuana and actually gained some support with the Senate Judiciary Committee when they voted to decriminalize all possession of marijuana under 1 ounce. And aside from Jimmy Carter's disastrous economic stagflation, he also legalized home brewing, so thanks for that. But Carter's more lenient stance on drugs was overwhelmingly shadowed by Reagan's reinvigorated hardline stance on drugs following. It was during the Gipper's presidency that the government went Super Saiyan with the war on drugs, and it literally became a street war. He and his administration painted drug users as criminals, a sidestep from Nixon's feigned perception of public health. It was during the 1980s that drug charges were expanded and penalties were severely increased. There was a rapid growth in incarceration of nonviolent, victimless crimes associated from drug use. The 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act imposed mandatory prison sentences that, either intended or not, were disproportionately aimed at the black community. This no apparent than the disparity in sentencing between crack and powder cocaine. The black communities were much more inclined to use and deal crack cocaine, whereas the upper class white community more involved in powder cocaine. 5 grams of crack equaled 5 years in prison, but it took 500 grams of powder cocaine to gain that same sentencing, with no difference in chemical composition or intended effect. These questionable actions surrounding both Nixon and Reagan's apparent racism were unfortunately confirmed in 2019 with the release of a conversation by the National Archives between the two, which divulged extremely derogatory statements aimed at black people. The 40-plus year war on drugs has culminated in no significant results to curb drug use or deter the possession or distribution of it. In fact, due to the severe criminality of drug possession and the amount in which garners significant prison time, drugs of old are now being infused with different chemicals and synthetic materials to make them more potent and therefore more dangerous, in effort to require less to take the same effect as a normal dose. There are also untampered crime statistics that dispute the narrative that more drugs correlates with more crime. Of course, official crime statistics skew this perception on paper because the criminalization of drugs automatically increases crime in the area. But unassociated drug crimes like robbery and assault tend to remain about the same regardless of drug use. We can all agree that the abuse of any drug is a health concern, just like the abuse of other legal substances like alcohol and tobacco. But it still should be an individual choice, and it is immoral for the government to dictate which substances can or cannot be consumed. The addiction should be the action of concern, not the substance. Addiction is a treatable health issue, and there have been numerous studies that object to the dated theory that one hit of these substances make you addicted. Renowned neuroscientist Dr. Carl Hart has proved that one hit theory incorrect, and that other factors like genetics and socioeconomic environments contribute to addiction, not the substance itself. He says science should be driving our drug policies, even if it makes us uncomfortable. Decriminalization is the only humane thing to do, and it embraces America's original institution of individual liberty. We can look at Portugal as an example of what happens when an entire country that struggled with drug use sets to change the stigma. They fully decriminalized all drugs in 2001, and after 20 years, the results are encouraging. They are now below all of Europe's average drug use. Drug treatment went up by 60%. New HIV and AIDS cases decreased by up to 95% in some areas. Fatalities due to drug overdose dropped almost 80%, arrests down 60%, and drug violations fell from 44 to 24%. This just highlights the benefits of decriminalizing drugs and its use. On top of that, it would inadvertently improve the racial disparity within our prison system. But above all that, drug laws are an infringement on our liberty. They are a booming recognition of the government asserting its perceived moral superiority over private citizens, and the stigma it cultivated, turning the real problem of addiction into the degradation of citizens and their choice of substance consumption. I cannot say this enough, but living in a free society means that we must humble ourselves on what we think is best for others or society. Whatever moral or spiritual righteousness that drives our principles are not under any condition a foundation for the obligation of others to capitulate to our beliefs. Drug use isn't the problem, but interfering with an individual's right to autonomy and liberty is.